Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Wiseman. It's a great privilege to be able to join you using the magic of technology here. Thank you so much for allowing the flexibility for this. I am from Lehigh University in the United States, but I'm very happy to say that I've had a very productive collaboration with the University of Tübingen, thanks to Professor Karen Amos for many, many years. And a lot of the themes and topics that I'm going to be talking about today are a result of the productive and, quite frankly, really rich collaboration and work that I've done really as a result of conversations with Professor Almas and Professor Rostock. So thank you to both of them, not only for organizing this conference, but also for being such wonderful collaborators. We've been working as a sort of a transatlantic team on the idea of scientization for many years now, and last year we had another fruitful discussion at a similar conference at the University of Tübingen, looking more closely at scientization. So I'm going to build on that a little bit today, or hopefully a lot today, and I'm going to do that by focusing on this concept of algorithmization, specifically looking at algorithmization and how it has embedded itself or has become a sort of necessary characteristic of education worldwide, looking specifically at national educational assessments and policymaking. So having said that, I'm going to jump right in. So there are a few phases that I'm going to, or phases of the presentation, I should say, that I'm going to walk through. And I just wanted to let you know right up front that I plan on giving a bit of time to the background of this topic and trying to figure out how national and international educational assessment and policymaking is algorithmized by looking at some of the context for that, by conceptualizing it, and this is where I'm going to try to do my best to bring the, how do I say it, the theoretical parts of scientization and NeoInstitutional theory together to talk more about algorithmization and transhumanism. And then the content, so thinking about what are the actual outcomes related to international and then national assessment and policy making that are resulting from these things. I'm then going to move over to this bridging idea, where I'm going to try to bridge the conceptual to the evidence. And this sounds sort of like data mining and evidence-based and database decision-making already. So I hope this doesn't turn out to be too tautological, where I'm talking about and then doing the same things. But I'm going to talk about the issue of policy borrowing. Policy borrowing is a very interesting and much debated phenomenon in my field of comparative and international education. And it's something that I think is really relevant to this algorithmization idea. Then I'm going to try to make some other specific connections to education and how education itself becomes institutionalized, scientized, and algorithmized in education systems, and then in comparative education policy and other sorts of discourse worldwide. And then I'm going to end by talking about some characteristics of algorithmization of international and national educational assessment and policy. And this is where I'm going to provide you with about 6 different characteristics that I think are ways that we could measure, or ways that we could observe, and ways that we can talk about the algorithmization process. So in short, what I'm doing here is I'm really trying to point out how the international and national educational assessment phenomenon has become mechanized and institutionalized, and therefore falls outside of the range of human decision-making a lot of the time, and has become maybe not yet fully automated, but is in many ways on autopilot, meaning that while the human educational policymakers and educators might be involved in some of the decision making, it's limited. In other words, they have a boundary where their ideas about what is rational and what is appropriate and what is possible cannot pass. And that is limited in large part because of the assessment data that is being not just used, but required in order to make policy and then adjust practice in schools and educational settings worldwide. So let's start with background, context, concept, and content. When I first talked with Professor Amos about the idea of transhumanism, and she was explaining to me how the idea of transhumanism was where we were going for this conference, and we talked about how it was related to our ongoing collaboration. First of all, it was a fascinating turn, and one that I think I was ready to make, maybe I should put it that way. And it made me think of this example, this hole-in-the-wall education project, which some of you may have heard of before. It is a project that was conducted or began in New Delhi in 1999 is when it started. It was, in short, a project where researchers thought, you know, what would it take to provide education to the least, or the most, I'll put it this way, the most vulnerable among us, or the most disadvantaged, or those who have the least opportunity for interaction with teachers or to go to school. And they literally put a computer in the wall of their institute in Delhi, and it was immediately tried out by the youth living in that region of India. The youth living on the streets were without any instruction, without any teachers guiding them, without any curriculum. They were engaging with these computers that were literally just stuck in the wall. And you can see a photo of what it looked like after it got funded by the Department of Education and sort of moved forward that way. And they were learning things. And the question that I posed actually to a class of mine several years ago was, could you have education without teachers? And I would encourage you to take a look at that website, that edualt.wordpress.com website. That's actually a website that my class of graduate students at Lehigh University put together several years ago, looking at this phenomenon of education without humans. And the reliance on technology and the reliance on the assumption that having access to information was all that was necessary in order to build real understanding and provide the foundation for further education really became apparent very quickly to this group of graduate students doing this research. But it also is something that became a big part of the hole-in-the-wall education project, and this idea of minimally invasive education here was an idea that has taken in many ways the human component out of state-sponsored education or mass education systems, and it has become in many ways transhuman. We could talk about what that means, and perhaps that would be worth debating some other time. I'm using this more as a context for where we're moving going forward. So if we could start to think of ways that data was provided or information was provided that could serve instead of the human teachers that were part of a normal education system, we can also start thinking about ways that data or information can be used to drive the policies and drive the processes that make up education in the first place. In other words, it can be an automated process to some degree, and automated in the sense that it is not reliant on the interpretation of individuals or the interpretation of humans, but it is based on pure data and pure evidence. Now, I want to take us for a minute and talk a little bit about my own conceptual framework for this and how I'm sort of putting all these pieces together. One of the things that if you're familiar at all with NeoInstitutional theory, this will sound a little redundant, but the idea behind NeoInstitutional theory is that there are many ways that we can talk about change in institutions worldwide. One of those institutions obviously being the institution of education, which is where most of my interests lie. And in thinking about neo-institutional theory, the idea is that how we do education, whether it's at the national level, the regional level, the local level, the classroom level, is a result of scripts or models for what is considered to be or accepted to be the correct or the appropriate or the legitimate way of doing education. And so without going too much in depth with this, we can see, and perhaps you will recognize that there is a fairly familiar model for what modern universal education looks like. It's the school, classroom, teacher, curriculum model that, quite frankly, most of us here right now participated in during our school age years, and many of us, myself included, is still a part of. I mean, this is my profession. I still work very heavily in this. And it's not a world that any of us would find surprising because it is scripted. And it does follow a rather shared model across all sorts of systems, so that you see this sort of school idea in every country and in every society, especially those that have a functioning government. And one of the reasons why this persists is because in order to gain legitimacy as an individual or as a community, it helps if we adhere to an accepted model or script for education. So as an easy example, myself as a professor, I have a lot of legitimacy because I gained my own education through a very traditional, legitimized route. I went through a basic education. I then went on to university. I followed the steps for my graduate and advanced degrees. I've worked in those schools as well, both at the secondary level and at the higher education level. It's a never-ending series of legitimacy seeking, quite frankly. And it has given me, in many ways, a lot of opportunities then to break some of the rules because I have such a firm foundation in this legitimized process of education. But change still takes place, and things don't always stay the same. And the idea of change, actually, I should go back up to coupling here. Coupling is the idea that even though there might be these scripts or models, that the content, the stuff that goes on inside of the schools and the classrooms and inside of the curriculum, so to speak, or the national system, there's some room for variation. But just like this idea that I was talking about earlier of there being some sort of limit to what can happen and boundary to actions and behaviors, the same is true of education. There is a limit or a boundary around the legitimized models for mass education. That means that there can be a lot of variation, actually, quite frankly, within the education system itself. For example, we might have variations in the kinds of history that are taught, or the languages that are spoken, or the emotions that are felt when people interact, or the ideas that are generated when there's discussion. All of these things can vary tremendously, so that what happens in a ninth grade English class in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in the United States might be very different from what actually happens in a ninth grade English class in Tübingen, Germany. However, the structure, the classroom, the curriculum, the idea that we have subjects like English, those are all part of that model, that script. So there's variation within that sort of bounded, rationalized version of what education is. And then change within that system occurs in a couple of different ways, and this is where institutional theory gets a little more specific. And I'll summarize more quickly because I know I'm spending a little time on this. There's coercive, which is by force. There's mimetic, which is copying or mimicking. And there's normative isomorphism. And isomorphism is just another word for slow change. Although there's more to it than that, but slow change is good for now. Normative isomorphism is when things become legitimized to the point that the origin, the coercive or the mimetic origin, is no longer the prime rationale for that change or the way of doing things. But it happens because it happens. It happens because we take it for granted. It happens because we've always done it this way. It happens because this is our tradition. mean, there are many ways to phrase what normative isomorphism is, but once it gets embedded, this really becomes, in many ways, the sort of key characteristic of an institutionalized system like education, for example. And so last year, we spent some time talking a lot about scientization, and we have a team here at Lehigh University that worked very hard to think of ways that we could empirically observe, and back to maybe being a little tautological, how can we use data to find out what scientization was? So we looked at a lot of policies, both at the national level and among international organizations, and we found that there were 4 characteristics of scientization. Quantification, which is the reliance on numerical information to characterize and to explain education in literally every system and across systems worldwide. Commodification, which was the idea that knowledge has value, or information and data has value. Therefore, education is a way of seeking value that can be exchanged for money or other things of value on the market. The idea of education as a panacea, meaning that there is a trust or a reliance or maybe a naivete that leads whole societies to believe that education can solve problems that more rightly fit within the domains of society or economics or politics. And yet education is often argued to be the solution for those problems that might occur in those domains, regardless of the ability of education to actually make a difference, back to this isomorphism idea. And then we talked about the cyborg dialectic, which is a phrase that I always want to make sure I give credit to Anna Rostock for bringing to our attention. It is a fascinating phrase, and it means this integration of the ideas of education through humanity or humans and technology. And it can be something, the cyborg dialectic and the ways that technology and education and humans become part of a symbiotic process where each relies upon the other and literally depends upon the other, is something that we could argue goes back decades or even a century, because what consists of technology can be something as simple as a book or something as advanced as artificial intelligence. So with these 4 characteristics of scientization, we made the argument last year that we could observe scientization in action in the ways that education was scientized through the policy documents in these many different countries and international organizations. But, and this is where I'm going to draw a little bit on the screen, so indulge me for a second, please. What we found was that if we wanted to, well, what we then talked about and what I'm going to present to you right now is that this idea of algorithmization and transhumanism, which we have over on the right side here, are really connected very strongly to the idea of scientization. And in particular, there are 2 factors that seem to spend a lot of time in that area. Quantification seems to link very easily to algorithmization. Cyborg dialectic, not surprisingly, links very easy to transhumanism. And so in thinking about how algorithmization and transhumanism relate to one another, we're thinking about how data becomes a replacement for decision-making that occurs in educational policymakers and actual classroom teachers or other educators' own thinking processes when they're engaged with school. But when we quantify and when we datify, maybe I should say that, the things that happen in our classrooms and our educational systems, one of the things that comes out of that is the reliance on algorithms in order to interpret the information. The other thing is that we now have, in many ways, turned over or shifted the symbiotic relationship that I just talked about with the cyborg dialectic in the favor of the technology, the mechanisms rather than the machines rather than the humans involved with this. So that's the framework that we're using, and that's where I'm going with this moving forward. Now, the reason why I started talking about international and national educational assessment as part of this process, and why I'm going to stick with that for the rest of the conversation, is that Pisa and TIMSS, the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study, and many other international assessments like that, are increasingly turning to technology and computer-based or adaptive testing methods, and relying on education through these large-scale assessments to provide us, being the customers or the consumers of education, giving us the tools to make decisions based on this information, which might be beyond our own individual experiences, or quite frankly, often are beyond our own individual experiences. And as an example, just to show how this reliance has begun, I wanted to show the first three of several strategic objectives that the folks at Pisa have put together. It's from this document that is cited down here, called Beyond Pisa 2015, a longer-term strategy of Pisa, that the OECD put out. Now, let me just run through these quickly, these first three objectives. There are more, but these are the ones that I think are the most relevant. Objective 1 says to continue exploiting the advantages of computer-based testing. So we've got computer-based testing, including increasing the use of adaptive testing. This is testing that changes based on the abilities and the responses of the students that are actually taking the test. Allowing to progressively diminish the distinction between major and minor domains, meaning that we're no longer having to separate information into categories as much, or distinct categories as much, but we can actually start to merge some of that because of this adaptive testing and computer-based mechanism. And facilitating the better management of non-cognitive outcomes, meaning that we can use large-scale assessment like Pisa now to facilitate better measuring things that are not related, quite frankly, to test taking or to performance on tests. Non-cognitive outcomes are things like behavior and thoughts and relationships and impressions and feelings. That's fascinating. And it suggests that this data that is coming from Pisa, which is a great example of an international large-scale assessment, is expanding in its scope in a way and being used in order to influence in a way that has really never been thought of before, or at least not, it has, Pisa and other large-scale assessments haven't been thought of so much as non-cognitive measurement tools. Objective 2 says to aim for greater synergies between Pisa and OECD and other international surveys, meaning that, and data, meaning that now we can combine large-scale data sets or big data collections on education in order to provide more coherent information about learning outcomes as students move through the education system. So this is big data, right? We are putting data together in ways that we've never been able to before. This has been tried, by the way. There's a thing called XTXS, cross time, cross space. It was put together. It was an initiative put together by the National Center for Educational Statistics in the United States and an independent research organization called the American Institutes for Research a couple of years ago, and it attempted to do the same thing, looking at Pisa and TIMSS and large-scale assessment data from nations specifically, and combining it all into one data set. And it was a very large and initially pretty well-funded initiative that has now moved on. And then we have objective 3, to continue to seek methodological and analytical means to strengthen the policy relevance and analytical power of Pisa, including establishing best practice for linking Pisa with national assessments. So now we have the link between international and national assessments, and the idea that we can strengthen policy relevance if we can create these better mechanisms of data collection and analysis. So the context is there. The content is sort of ready to be examined. And now we're going to move on to this bridge. So how do we think about bridging educational data mining, that's EDM, to this idea of algocracy, which Danaher presents to us, and I wish I'd been there for the keynote opener. Well, first of all, some fascinating ideas. How do we bridge the two? How do we start to make this connection in ways that make sense so that we can understand how education itself is algorithmized? Well, first of all, let's just figure out what each of these things is. If we look at Scheuer and McLaren from 2011, we can see that educational data mining, or EDM, is concerned with developing, researching, and applying computerized methods to detect patterns in large collections of educational data. So we're interested in patterns, right? Patterns that would otherwise be hard or impossible to analyze due to the enormous volume of data they exist within. So pattern recognition, and then using those patterns to analyze what's happening and make decisions. Algocracy from Danaher in 2016 is a system in which, and by the way, he mentions, maybe he mentioned this before to you guys directly, that there are other ways of thinking about this, but I think this is a really interesting way to talk about it. Saying that algocracy is a system in which algorithms are used to collect, collate, and organize the data upon which decisions are typically made, and to assist in how that data is processed and communicated through the relevant governance system. In this case, we're going to talk about the education system. In doing so, the algorithms structure and constrain the ways in which humans within those systems interact with one another. By the way, I'd just like to point out this right here is normative isomorphism within the theory of neo-institutionalism. So structure and constrain the ways in which humans within those systems interact with one another, the relevant data, and the broader community affected by those systems. So it's basically back to pattern recognition, and I know I'm sort of being a little reductionist here. I'm thinking about how we can condense this into the most simple definition and the most appropriate explanation possible. But we have pattern recognition, and then we have this idea that we can make decisions using that data, and then we can communicate those decisions through the governance system, in this case, like I said, the education system, in ways that will structure or constrain humans within those systems and how they interact with one another. That's interesting, and that's potentially dangerous, but also fascinating. So how can we understand this more fully? How can we recognize when this is happening? And how can we place this within the broader idea of, again, my field of comparative and international education and national educational policymaking? Well, again, we have a little bit of a phenomenon that we have to deal with first, and it's this idea, and I'm stealing this from Shriver, this idea that we have these sort of dialectical processes of standardization and variation that are going on all the time, where standardization is the global spread of transnationally standardized education models. That's the legitimacy seeking that we talked about before, and the idea that we have models that go with that. And then we have the persistence of varying socio-cultural interrelationship networks, meaning that there's a lot of stuff that happens within these standardized education models that is unique to that community, those people, their language, their culture, etc. So this would be, I'm going to use the word coupling if I'm going to bring this back to institutional theory, and maybe I'll call it decoupling or loose coupling. To indicate that the coupling that occurs between these networks and behaviors and other things that happen is happening within these educational models. Let's say this is the model, and it's happening within the model, but it's happening differently all over the place, so that there are many different ways throughout the world that all fit within this same standardized model, but the actual way that it happens in, again, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania might be very different from the way that it happens in Tübingen, Germany. It just happens to be that we both fit within the same standardized model. And as a result of fitting within that same standardized model, there's a practice called policy borrowing that has become the bane of a lot of comparative education scholars and a lot of educational policymakers worldwide, which David Phillips and his colleague Oakes talked about in 2003. I won't go into this right now. This is their vision of what the processes of policy borrowing are. But it has to do with the phenomenon that I sort of just talked about. And it has a couple of impacts on decision making. Basically, policy borrowing means that you take, if I'm an educational policymaker in Pennsylvania, the state of Pennsylvania in the United States, but I'm familiar with the kinds of things that happen in Baden-Württemberg in Germany. And I say, you know what? Baden-Württemberg has figured out how to, let's say, transition secondary students into the labor market. I don't know if that's true, but I hope it is. But if it is true, and I say, wow, they've done a really good job there, let's find out what their system is, and let's try to implement that in Pennsylvania, then I am borrowing the policy. I'm policy borrowing. Okay? So what happens when policy borrowing becomes the norm? And quite frankly, it is the norm. Well, you have an increasing availability of international comparative educational information, not only that results from that policy borrowing, but also feeds it. You have an intensified comparative education environment, meaning that education policymakers and decision makers are constantly looking for data from other places. I will give you an example of that. Some of you know that I do a fair share of really enjoyable and interesting work with different educational policymakers and education groups in Saudi Arabia. And one of the first steps in just about every project that I've been involved in with my colleagues in Saudi Arabia has involved spending a significant amount of time finding out what is done that works really well in other countries first. And then there'll be a report on this is what the norms are in these 5 different countries, and here's what we should be doing in relation to that and ways that we can use that model. So this comparative educational environment becomes very big. We then obviously have national, regional, and local variations that conflict with the standardized model or approach. I gave you an example here about this messy circle with all the different things that go on inside of it. That's the conflicting. And then we have this idea that there are unique differences and needs within each national educational environment, meaning that we have to figure out what's going on in each national environment. And it's hard to just say that there's a one-size-fits-all approach. But this is where the idea of algorithmization comes in, and the idea of looking for patterns. Because now we can take data that might have been overwhelming for the individual, or even for groups of individuals, and we can interpret that using these algorithms. Just a few more things about policy borrowing. This is from Holzinger and Nil. They argue that networks of policy experts who share common principled beliefs over ends, causal beliefs over means, and common standards of accruing and testing new knowledge make up this sort of transnational problem-solving group. And there have been article after article, many of which I've written, that have argued that this transnational problem solving applies to the ways that national education systems use large-scale assessment data, whether it's from international standardized assessments like Pisa or TIMSS, or from local national assessments. For example, in the United States, it might be NAEP, or in Pennsylvania, it might be the PSSAs, which I can't remember exactly what it stands for. Pennsylvania Standardized Student Assessment, I think. And then they share these common beliefs of ends, causal beliefs, and common standards, but that doesn't mean that it's going to actually work in each of the different communities that they're borrowing into because of the variation that occurs. Now, there are a lot of critiques of policy borrowing and the policy borrowing rationale. Fran Vavris is one of those who critique policy borrowing. One of the ways that she's talked about it, actually, way back in 2004, so she's been able to put this argument out there for a while, is that if we look at the study of borrowing and lending, we can explore how the language of policy in education in particular is externalized without reference to a specific lending country or agency. And so Vavris argues that the intensification of global networks in recent years has contributed to the universalization of keywords. Now, when she talks about the universalization of keywords, this is indicative of a shared discourse that is part of standardized processes. But what this does is it allows us now to take these standardized processes and start to mechanize them or routinize them so that we have a way to collect data, measurable data, and we can monitor these processes using this measurable data around a shared set of terms, universalization of keywords. The assumption being, I think, by a lot of policymakers is that these shared terms are also indicative of shared meaning, but they aren't always, because what a school is to me might not be what a school is to somebody else, even though we think of the same legitimized model. So universalized, rationalized scripts lay the foundation for an algocracy of education through education data mining because of a few key factors. One has to do with shared expectations and values regarding what education is and how it should be structured or studied. So we start with the foundation, we start with the belief that we're all on the same page, that we all have the same understanding of what it is that we're trying to measure. You have to start with this if you're going to use big data, because otherwise you're always, or maybe I should say, otherwise you're never going to agree with one another. So we have to start with a basic assumption if we want to use this data, and I'm being a little bit of a devil's advocate here, if we have to start with a shared assumption if we want to use the data, because otherwise we'll never come to consensus. And so large-scale data assessments test the same things. I'm using air quotes here when I say same, because they're the same thing in terms of the term used or the measure that's actually used to collect the data. But what the meaning is might be quite different. Universalized, rationalized scripts also construct education in a rationalized way that emphasizes capacity, diversity, and efficiency within the boundaries of shared expectations. So again, it's a very positive development, positive in air quotes again, meaning that if we have these universalized, rationalized scripts for education, the way that we collect data on education then constructs it in a way that is rationalized, in a way that can be explained, and then you can use data to observe it. And then these rationalized constructions are quantifiable and therefore data friendly. So that brings me to the characteristics of algorithmization. If you followed me so far, and it's making some sense, I hope, I've gotten to the point where I want to talk about these 6 characteristics of the algorithmization of international and national assessment and educational policymaking. There are 6 of them. I'm going to go through each individually and try to explain each with some examples and some explanation. And where I'm going with this is I think that this provides us now with a foundation for actually seeing how the algorithmization of education is working in relation to, and by working I don't mean it's working in a way that's right or correct. I mean the mechanism by which it happens, because I think there's no way that we can doubt that it's happening. So now, how do we understand it? We have to be able to describe the process first and to look for key characteristics. So these are 6 key characteristics that I'm arguing are a key part of the algorithmization of education. The first of which is vicious cycles. So remember, part of the idea behind educational data mining is that we need to have a pattern. We need to find patterns. How do you find patterns? Well, you could analyze the data that you have from one cycle of information, but it would be a lot more interesting if you had data from multiple cycles. And so I'm using the term vicious cycles here. It's a play on a popular term that many of you probably know about, vicious cycle or vicious circle. But the idea is that on a regular basis now, since 1995 for TIMSS and since 2000 for Pisa, we've had layer after layer of very large data that's been collected just from these 2 large-scale assessments. That doesn't include the hundreds of others, from nation-specific large-scale assessments to other international assessments that are conducted either by the OECD or the IEA. And they happen on a regular basis. In terms of Pisa, it's every 3 years. In terms of TIMSS, it's every 4 years. The data itself can be collated with one another, but it is this sort of never-ending cycle of data collection and then some analysis, but really the emphasis is mostly on collection. And so we get these data collection cycles, and they happen not just with the international, but in national as well, or state in the United States as well. And this provides us with a foundation for not only our data mining, but also our foundation for pattern recognition and pattern seeking, because we can start to do similar things happen over time. This isn't longitudinal, but we have a slice every 3 to 4 years. Rhythmic applications. Rhythmic applications means that we have a rhythm by which we see educational data collected and then actually used. And I'm going to focus on the used part for rhythmic applications. And I'm suggesting, if you look over here, and let me switch back to my, oops. Well, let me try to take that away first. I'm going to switch back to my laser pointer. There we go. So legitimacy seeking over here, we've already talked about, right? And being able to use large-scale data for legitimacy seeking is something that happens from the most developed to the least developed, or the most legitimized to the least legitimized national education systems that are out there. The United States very much uses, I'll just use as an example since I'm standing in the United States right now, uses our participation in Pisa and TIMSS and then the resulting average student achievement scores in an effort to legitimize either the education system, broadly speaking, or more often the problems and reforms that need to be done to solve those problems in our education system. There's also a very common issue with a common rhythmic application of large-scale data, in that, especially in countries where there is either a developing or a less developed educational system, that assessment capacity can be built up by participating in these. And so that's a frequent argument that's made, is that if you participate in TIMSS or PISA or some other large-scale assessment, you will be able to have not only the infrastructure, that would be the facilities and the technical resources you need to conduct assessment, but you'd also have the personnel and their capacity, meaning their knowledge and skills, that will help you use that data moving forward. This is a rhythmically applied rationale that happens every cycle of Pisa, TIMSS, etc. in many countries worldwide. We have the idea of external comparison. I just told you that there's this idea, when I give you the example from when I work with the Saudis, that comparing ourselves to other countries is especially important. And I've given you some examples over here of what that looks like. These are clippings out of different newspapers. I think one is in Portuguese, so from Portugal, from the Ministry of Education in Singapore, and then there's an article from China back here that talk about the rankings. So external comparison in terms of the rankings and the pure rankings in terms of average student assessment, and then trying to rank their scores on average. I went the wrong direction. Their scores on average against each other. This is a very common thing. I mean, you would expect this every time there's a release of data. And then that leads typically to some sort of internal accountability and enhanced monitoring and evaluation system that was going to look more closely at how education is produced and how, in particular, teachers are trained. I've just been doing some work on that recently, looking at how international results on PISA and TIMSS affect attitudes about and measures of teacher quality in different countries. And just to be honest, the teachers always get the short stick. They always get shamed or blamed. And then that leads us to institutionalized data-based decision-making, which is the term of the day, and really where this algorithmization of education is leading to and comes from. And I'll talk about that more in a little bit. We also have an idea of data indulgence, and we can see this in a couple of different ways. I'm not going to click on this right now, but if you were to Google Big Data and Education, 2nd edition by R.S. Baker, you would see it's an online textbook instructing, quite frankly, anyone how to use big data to analyze and make decisions about education. And the idea is not that we need to do it. The idea is the data is there. Remember, I said a couple slides ago, this data is being collected no matter what. I can tell you that most of this data is not being analyzed. And these are, again, just 2 of the assessments that are out there that are collecting data on education. There's so many others. So we have so much data, we become bloated with data. It's like a toddler at a birthday party eating too much cake, right? It's just, it's there, and it tastes good, so you eat it. And the same is true of education data. It's there, and it it feels good, or it makes political sense, or it is a way to legitimize my project. So you use it, and then you collect more. I've given you a couple of examples here, making the data grade and classroom data miss. These are both, I know they're hard to read, and I'm not going to go through them, but these are both graphics that are used by pro-big data scholars, researchers, and policymakers to suggest all of the positive things that come from just sort of collecting this overwhelming abundance of data. And then you also have the idea that we can indulge in data. I'm using myself as an example here, so you can't call me, I guess, too much of a hypocrite because I'm using myself as a negative example. But we have so much data that we can use data from countries we don't even understand or know. I've never been to. This is an article that I wrote with a colleague in Saudi Arabia about education in Iran and Kuwait. At the time when this was written, I, just to be honest, knew very little about both Iran and Kuwait, and I was kind of relying on my friend from Saudi Arabia to be the expert. But the truth of the matter is, he doesn't know much about Iran and Kuwait either, and what they do in their education systems. And yet, we conducted an analysis using Tim's data of both countries' educational systems, and then we published that in what I consider to be a very good, very highly read and high-ranking journal in my field. The idea is that we have so much data, we don't even have to know the context in order to analyze the data. The data is just there, so why not use it? Data indulgence. We also have this idea of virtual realities. So the fact that there is so much data out there, but that people are looking at the data in a way that looks for patterns, remember that. And so we can create these ideas of what the best practice is, or what the best system is, using the data that comes from that. So for example, the OECD has done this look at strong performers and successful reformers in education. This happens to be a booklet here that's specifically for Peru, but you can find these for a lot of different countries. And what they did was they used the Pisa data to identify countries that had scored below what they thought they should, or below the international average on a previous cycle of Pisa. And then they dramatically improved their average student achievement in the next cycle of Pisa. And so they looked at them and they said, what did they do? What did these 5 or 6 countries, I think, do in order to make these changes over the 3-year cycle? And then how can we use them as examples? And they become case studies. But I can tell you that when educational policymakers hear about this kind of information, they become virtual realities. They become a reality for those policymakers that is not their own. So Peruvian policymakers can look at, say, for example, Japan as one of the strong performers and successful reformers. So Peru can look at the Japanese case study and see how they managed to facilitate their shift in overall student achievement and say, oh my gosh, this could be the reality for us. This is back to the policy borrowing idea, right? And we create these false or fake realities related to education, and then we say, well, just because you're sitting in Peru doesn't mean that you can't live this reality that occurred in Japan or in Romania or one of the other countries that was a strong performer and successful reformer. And so that education system is then borrowed. And the idea of creating generic versions of what the best education system are is what I mean when I say virtual realities. We have the idea of value-free addictions that is part of the algorithmization of education. And value-free addictions is kind of what it means. We have an addiction to these large-scale assessments, whether they be at the international or national level, regardless of whether or not they make a positive impact. And this is where I'm going back to the institutional theory perspective and the scientization sort of quantification arguments, is that these assessments, they don't necessarily tell us anything. I'm just going to say that out loud. There are a lot of big data. It's a lot of data. And we can see, you know, how students perform on average on these standardized tests, and then try to make some sort of decisions about what caused them to score so well or so badly if they scored below the average. and then try to make improvements based on that. But there's no sense of which comparisons are really the right or wrong ones. And this is where the value-free part comes in. We're addicted to this data. But is it always right to compare? Is it always right to use the big data? Is it always helpful? Does it always give you a solution? And the answer is not really. It doesn't always. Instead, we can have a sense of whether the comparison or the use of the data is technically, statistically, or procedurally possible. But that doesn't mean that we should be doing it. I'll give you these two examples here. Some of you may have heard, I'm being a little sarcastic, that Finland did quite well on Pisa not long ago. Finland and Singapore in particular, but Finland is the one I want to focus on. Finland is an obsession now for several different national education systems in the Arabian Peninsula. I've talked about Saudi Arabia a little bit now. Now I'm going to pick on the United Arab Emirate of Abu Dhabi and also Qatar, and point out that there are schools in both of these countries that are Finnish exports or imports, I should say. They're copies of Finland. So Abu Dhabi, what Abu Dhabi did was they actually hired, I think, about 50 Finnish teachers, and they established 2 schools that are Finnish schools. This is a photo from one of them. And I believe this teacher must be Finnish. And these schools, they imported the Finnish teachers, and then the Finnish teachers, developed the curriculum that they wanted to use and the strategies they wanted to use in Abu Dhabi. And the idea was that Finland was the best. Finland was doing better than any other country on Pisa, and so we want them in Abu Dhabi. The problem is, Finland and Abu Dhabi are not the same. That sounds silly and simple to say, but it's incredibly important, and it's the first thing that's overlooked. The social, economic, and political history and reality of both of these locations, both of these cultures, is incredibly different. The educational development, growth, and reality, the present reality of both of these systems, is quite different. There are many things to admire about the Finnish system. Many things, and things that can be learned by, quite frankly, any country from the Finnish system and Finnish teachers in particular. But wholesale copying based on what the data, and quite frankly, a very limited data set, tells you is the best system is a bit of a problem. That's an addiction. There's another international school in Qatar that has also adopted sort of this Finnish model, and whatever the Finnish model is interesting as well, because how do you say that Finland has a model when it only works in Finland? So value-free addictions. There's no sense in making comparisons when there is no impact to those comparisons. And what's happened with the Abu Dhabi Finnish schools is that they have created what essentially is a professional development model for Abu Dhabi Emirati teachers. And so there are Emirati teachers who work with the Finnish teachers, and the Finnish teachers mentor or apprentice some of those Abu Dhabi Emirati teachers. And I think it's turned out to be a really nice model for professional development for those Emirati teachers. But there is not a lot of evidence that there is a huge change in the education that's happening for the Emirati students that are in those schools. Because the students that are in these schools are already, it's not a random selection or a representative sample from Abu Dhabi. These are privileged, wealthy families for the most part that are already participating. These are Emirati children for the most part that are participating. They were already advantaged to begin with. So not a lot of change there. And then we have zombie policymaking. Pardon for the GIF. I didn't realize it would actually move when I showed the presentation, and I tried to get it to stop, and I can't figure out how. So there you go. So zombie policymaking. On one hand, I'd like to focus on these ideas from Danaher about where humans are in the loop of data use and decision making. And then I want to focus on this idea of using data, broadly speaking, that happens with policymaking. So Danaher has a really interesting, and maybe you already talked about it, so if so, just skip ahead like 5 minutes. Really interesting way of thinking about where humans are in, on, or out of the loop of decision making using data. And this is something that I thought was really interesting in relation to large-scale assessment data like TIMSS, Pisa, and other national assessments, where humans can be, let's say, on the loop versus out of the loop. And on the loop means that the data is already interpreted. It's already, there are choices that can be made with the algorithms that interpret the data. And then humans can take that data and make decisions about what happens in their classroom or in their school or in their district or in their part of the system. But when you go to human out of the loop, there's an automated process of recommendations or decision making or action that occurs regardless of humans being the ones who flip the switch on or off to making that recommendation. And this is the, go to my, there we go. I'd like to draw again. This is how I'm connecting this. So I'm trying to draw. It's not letting me. Well, I'd like to draw a line across the middle as well. I think it's because of this GIF. So there should be an arrow going from human on the loop to data-based as well. So human in the loop, on the loop, and out of the loop. I am sort of setting or making an analogy that these are the same as data-informed, data-based, and data-driven. And we're talking about educational decision-making. Data-informed decision-making is when data is available, humans choose to use it, and it helps them make decisions. This allows for a lot of intuition. This allows for a lot of using information in ways that aren't logical, but might be based on experience or past or feelings or a sort of unique contextual understanding, all ways that might not be patterned, right? Data-based means that there is the requirement that decisions be made using evidence or data. In the United States, we have now an institution called the Institute for Educational Sciences, which is, if you want money from the federal government to do any sort of educational research or reform, you go to the IES, the Institute for Educational Sciences, and it's required that your proposal be data-based. You have to be using evidence to show that what you want to do, what you want to research or actually do as a reform is going to work. A lot of people, when this first happened during the George W. Bush administration, were very vocal in saying, how do we know it's going to work until we've actually collected the data? And we can't collect the data until you fund our study. And the IES essentially said, tough, figure it out. Do it without our money first and then show us that it'll work and then we'll give you the money. And so making decisions based on data was very important, but it was still the humans making decisions. Still the people had to use the data to make their informed decisions. But data-driven is a different animal. Data-driven means that the decisions are part and parcel with the data. If the data says that arriving at school an hour early, it leads to higher achievement on the state assessment, then you will arrive to school an hour early. Right? There's not a lot of decision making that goes in between that. There's not a lot of buffering between what the data suggests and the actions that have to be made. And this is where we run into the problem of causality versus causation, or correlation versus causation, pardon me, correlation versus causation. So the assumption or the pitfall here is that a lot of correlation, a lot of pattern recognition can happen that is correlation rather than causation. In other words, things happen because they're part of a larger mix. But that larger mix might not have been recognized by the algorithm in the same way that the experienced human might recognize it. And so decisions can be made using that data or based on that data without the intervention of someone to say, you know what, there's another way to do it or another way that we can think about it. And then it becomes a bit of an issue, a bit of a problem, because now we have implemented a process based on data, driven by data, without human intervention that may or may not be actually the reason why something happens. So when you put all these together, and I'm going to try to go back because that moving zombie gif drives me nuts. I'm going to go back to this slide here. When I think about where algorithmization of national educational assessment and policy sort of comes from and where it goes, what I'm trying to do now is I'm trying to think of how do these 6 characteristics work in conjunction with one another. I mean, I have got them in sort of a linear form here on this page, but I think it's messier than this. And maybe I'm going to have to use an algorithm to figure it out. Thank you for letting me take some time to talk about this. I really enjoy this topic. I want to encourage any of you to please ask me questions if you have any. I'm not sure at this time whether or not I'll be there live or not, live via the magic of technology, or whether I won't be able to. But either way, my email address is down here. Please don't hesitate to send me an email at any time, aww207@lehigh.edu. I'd be more than happy to engage you in conversation about this or hear your thoughts and critiques. And hopefully we can figure out how to move forward and to do some real change, or make some real change and recommendations about change, because we understand how educational assessment and policymaking have become algorithmized. Thanks again.